The air in the studio was charged, thick with an unspoken tension. The cameras rolled, their lenses fixed on two figures sitting across from each other. On one side, Michael Reynolds, a seasoned journalist, known for making even the most confident figures squirm under pressure. On the other, Elon Musk, a man who had faced challenges far greater than an interview. Michael leaned forward, his expression calculated. He had built his career on exposing contradictions, and today was no different. He had gone after politicians, scientists, and celebrities, tearing through their carefully constructed answers until they had nothing left to hide. But this was different. The internet was already buzzing with clips of Musk's recent remarks, statements where he had, for the first time, spoken about faith. Not technology, not logic, not engineering. Faith. And that, in Michael's mind, was a contradiction worth dismantling. His voice was steady, carrying just the right amount of doubt. "So, Elon," he said, tilting his head, "you're the man who defied gravity, challenged governments, rewrote the future of transportation, and yet you talk about faith? Don't you think that's a little ironic?" A flicker of amusement crossed Musk's face, but he didn't answer immediately. Michael took that as an opportunity. "I mean," he continued, "for someone who's spent their life relying on facts, on numbers, on data, doesn't faith go against everything you stand for?" The silence stretched. The audience, the crew, everyone watching, waited. They expected Musk to falter, to explain, to justify. But Musk didn't. Instead, he just sat there, calm, unreadable. Michael's confidence flickered for the briefest moment. This wasn't how his interviews usually went. Normally, by this point, his guests would already be scrambling for an answer. But Musk? He was just watching. And that's when Michael realized something unsettling. He wasn't leading this conversation anymore. Michael adjusts his posture, shifting slightly forward. His expression sharpens, his eyes scanning Musk's face for the slightest hint of unease. He's ready to push, to probe, to find the contradiction he's certain exists. "You've built your career on logic," Michael begins, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. "On numbers, calculations, data. Now, you're talking about faith? That doesn't add up, does it?" Musk doesn't respond immediately. Instead, he studies Michael, his gaze unreadable. The silence stretches, thickening the air between them. The tension isn't spoken, but it's felt. Michael waits for an instant before continuing. "You're a man of precision," he presses. "Everything you've achieved, Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, none of it was built on belief. It was built on proof. So, tell me, Elon, where does faith fit into that?" Still, Musk remains still. No flicker of irritation, no sign of discomfort. The lights overhead hum softly, filling the quiet that Michael had expected to last only seconds. But now, with Musk refusing to rush, the silence begins working against Michael instead. He clears his throat, adjusting his position, but his confidence doesn't waver. "I mean, let's be honest here," he says, forcing a slight chuckle. "Faith is what people turn to when they run out of answers. But you don't wait for answers. You find them." Musk finally leans back, folding his hands together. His posture is relaxed, unaffected. "Is that what you think faith is?" His voice is calm, almost curious. Michael hesitates for a fraction of a second before responding. "Isn't it?" Musk tilts his head slightly, considering the question, but offers no immediate rebuttal. He lets Michael sit with his own words, the weight of his own assumption. Michael doesn't like the pause. It gives Musk too much control. He decides to push harder. "I just find it strange," he continues, keeping his tone casual, though his intent is anything but. "For someone who has spent his life proving the impossible to suddenly suggest that belief, without proof, has a place in progress." Musk exhales slowly, as if measuring his next words. But before he speaks, he lets another moment pass. This time, the silence belongs to him. Michael shifts again, the energy of the room subtly shifting with him. He had expected Musk to immediately counter his claim, to defend himself. But instead, Musk is letting the conversation unfold at his own pace. "Do you believe in the future, Michael?" Musk finally asks. Michael blinks, caught slightly off guard by the simplicity of the question. "What do you mean?" "The future," Musk repeats. "The one we haven't seen yet. The one no one can prove exists. Do you believe in it?" Michael frowns slightly, his confidence momentarily interrupted. "That's different." "Is it?" Musk asks, his voice even. "You can't touch the future. You can't measure it. Yet, you trust it's coming." Michael leans back, trying to reclaim his ground. "That's not the same as faith." Musk shrugs. "Depends on how you define it." The words settle between them, and for the first time, Michael doesn't immediately reply. He had entered this conversation certain of one thing, that faith and science could not coexist. Yet, Musk had just turned the entire argument around in a matter of seconds. The cameras capture everything. The stillness of Musk. The slightest tension creeping into Michael's expression. The interview was meant to expose contradictions in Musk's belief. But now, it's Michael who finds himself in unfamiliar territory. He isn't ready to concede. Not yet. But for the first time, he realizes this conversation isn't going in the direction he had planned. Michael crosses his arms, leaning forward as if preparing for the final blow. His confidence, slightly shaken before, returns with a sharper edge. He knows he needs to press harder, to get a reaction. "So let me get this straight," he says, voice laced with skepticism. "You're telling me that faith, something people believe in without evidence, belongs in the same conversation as science?" He chuckles, shaking his head. "I didn't expect that from you, Elon." Musk doesn't move. His expression remains unreadable, his gaze steady. The air in the room thickens as Michael waits for a sign of discomfort, but none comes. Michael decides to push further. "People look up to you because you represent reason, facts, innovation. If you start talking about faith, what stops the world from thinking that maybe all of your success, SpaceX, Tesla, everything, wasn't built on science, but on hope?" His words land with weight, designed to provoke. The audience senses it. A few members of the crew glance at one another. The tension is unmistakable. Musk finally tilts his head, studying Michael as if deciding whether or not to respond. Then, in a measured tone, he speaks. "Michael, do you think a rocket launches because of pure logic?" Michael blinks, caught off guard by the unexpected question. "What do you mean?" "A rocket," Musk continues, "isn't just an equation on a whiteboard. Before it lifts off, there's something more at play. A belief. The engineers working on it don't have absolute proof that it will work. They have data, calculations, models, but in the end, they have to trust in the unknown. That's faith." Michael shifts in his seat, shaking his head slightly. "That's not faith. That's probability. It's risk assessment, not belief in something unproven." Musk allows a small pause before replying, his tone unshaken. "And yet, every scientist who ever made a discovery, every pioneer who ever built something new, took a step forward without certainty. They worked with what they knew, but they moved ahead into what they didn't. They believed before they had the full picture. That's faith, Michael." Michael exhales sharply, gripping the armrest of his chair. He isn't used to losing control of an argument, especially not like this. "That's just optimism," he counters, though there's a hint of uncertainty in his voice. Musk leans forward slightly. "Call it what you want, but without it, we wouldn't have electricity, airplanes, or medicine. Without people daring to believe in something before they had proof, we wouldn't have progress." Michael shakes his head, his frustration starting to show. "You're twisting definitions," he says. "Faith isn't about discovery, it's about accepting something without proof." Musk's gaze sharpens slightly, but his tone remains calm. "No," he corrects. "Faith is about holding on to something before the evidence catches up. It's the gap between where we are and where we want to be." Michael opens his mouth to respond but hesitates. The audience feels it. The shift. The momentum is no longer in Michael's favor. The verbal battle that was meant to expose Musk is now forcing Michael to rethink his stance. The silence stretches between them, heavier now than before. Musk doesn't rush to fill it. He sits back, allowing Michael to absorb the weight of his own questions. For the first time, Michael looks like he's searching for the right words, rather than confidently delivering them. He had expected Musk to struggle, to contradict himself, to fall into a trap. But instead, it is he who feels unsteady. The interview isn't just a debate anymore. It's something more. Michael adjusts his tie, shifting in his seat as if trying to regain his footing. He isn't used to feeling unsettled during an interview. For years, he has prided himself on controlling conversations, leading his guests into corners where they struggle for answers. But now, something feels different. He straightens his posture, forcing a casual smirk. "All right, Elon," he says, his voice steady but missing its earlier sharpness. "Let's say faith does play a role in discovery. But isn't there a difference between trusting a process based on probability and believing in something without any proof?" Musk studies him, his gaze steady. "There is," he replies. "But tell me, Michael, before you sat in that chair today, before we started this conversation, did you know exactly how it would unfold?" Michael hesitates, caught off guard by the sudden shift. "Of course not," he says, frowning slightly. "Yet you came prepared," Musk continues. "You had your notes, your research, your expectations. You didn't have absolute proof of what would happen, but you believed in your ability to control the conversation. Isn't that a form of faith?" Michael scoffs, shaking his head. "That's confidence, not faith." Musk leans forward slightly. "Confidence in what? Your ability to read people? To predict responses? You didn't have certainty, only an idea of what might happen. But you believed in your preparation, in your instincts. That's not much different from an engineer trusting their calculations before a test flight." Michael opens his mouth to argue but stops himself. He hadn't expected this angle. He had spent years mastering the art of debate, yet Musk had turned the discussion into something far deeper than he anticipated. A beat of silence passes. The energy in the room shifts. The audience isn't just watching an interview anymore, they're witnessing something unfold. Michael clears his throat. "Okay, let's assume for a second that faith has a place in logic," he concedes. "But the kind of faith you're talking about, belief in progress, trust in a process, isn't the same as religious faith. People believe in science because it's proven over time. Faith, on the other hand, asks people to trust without evidence." Musk tilts his head, considering his response. "Not always," he says. "Think about explorers centuries ago. They set sail across oceans with no guarantee of what they'd find. They had no proof that land existed beyond the horizon, only belief. If they had waited for absolute evidence before taking that first step, they never would have left shore." Michael exhales slowly. The argument is solid, but he isn't ready to admit it. "Not yet. You're making it sound like we should accept things without questioning them," he challenges, grasping for control. Musk shakes his head. "Not at all. Question everything. Challenge ideas. But understand this, every breakthrough started as something unproven. If no one had faith in the unknown, we'd still be living in caves." Michael shifts again, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He had expected to expose contradictions in Musk's reasoning. Instead, he finds himself rethinking his own stance. The room feels different now. The audience can sense it. This isn't just a battle of words anymore. It's something bigger. For the first time in the interview, Michael hesitates before speaking. The moment hangs in the air, stretching longer than before. Musk waits, unbothered. He has no need to rush. Michael finally exhales, realizing that the conversation is no longer in his hands. Michael taps his fingers against the desk, his frustration barely masked behind a forced smile. He had expected Musk to stumble by now, to falter under the weight of his own argument. Instead, Musk remains composed, his expression steady. Michael exhales sharply, adjusting his position as he tries to regain control. "You're making it sound like faith is necessary for science," he says, voice edged with impatience. "But that's not true. Science is about facts, evidence, things we can prove. Faith? That's a feeling, a belief without proof." Musk doesn't react immediately. He allows a pause, long enough for the tension to deepen. When he finally speaks, his voice is measured, deliberate. "Michael," he says, "when the Wright brothers built the first airplane, do you think they had absolute proof it would fly?" Michael hesitates. "They had physics, engineering. They had theories," Musk corrects. "But no certainty, no guarantee. Until the moment that plane left the ground, all they had was belief that their work would pay off. They had calculations, yes, but they also had faith in the unknown." Michael's jaw tightens slightly, but Musk isn't finished. "Every breakthrough in human history began the same way," Musk continues. "A scientist staring at an equation that doesn't yet make sense. An explorer stepping into a land they've never seen. A doctor testing a cure that has never worked before. They don't have proof, not at first. What they have is the conviction to move forward anyway." The weight of those words settles over the room. Michael opens his mouth as if to argue, then closes it. Musk watches him for a moment before leaning back slightly. "Faith isn't the absence of logic," he says. "It's what pushes us toward it." Michael clears his throat, grasping at another angle. "But there's a difference between trusting a process and blind belief. People use faith to justify anything, even things that defy reason." Musk nods. "And that's why faith without action is meaningless. But faith backed by effort? That's how the world changes." Michael shakes his head, refusing to back down. "You're blurring the lines, Elon." Musk doesn't waver. "Am I?" he asks. "Or have we been taught to think that logic and belief must always be separate?" A silence stretches between them, heavier than before. The studio feels smaller, the air thicker. Michael shifts again, his usual confidence now replaced with something else. Reflection. The audience sees it. They feel it. Musk hasn't just answered the question. He's changed it entirely. Michael looks at him, searching for a flaw, a weak spot. But for the first time, he isn't sure what to say. The balance of the conversation has shifted. Michael shifts in his chair, adjusting his cuffs as if the slight movement might steady his thoughts. The interview had started with him holding control, steering the conversation with confidence. But now, something has changed. The energy in the room is no longer in his favor. His grip on the conversation is slipping, and he knows it. Still, he isn't ready to give in. He leans forward slightly, narrowing his eyes. "So, what exactly are you saying, Elon?" His voice is firmer now, more pointed. "That faith and science are just different sides of the same thing." Musk exhales slowly, almost as if he had expected this question all along. "No," he answers, his tone even. "I'm saying they serve different roles. Science asks how. Faith asks why. You need both." Michael scoffs lightly, though it's forced. He looks toward the crew, as if searching for some kind of unspoken approval, a cue that he still has control. But the faces staring back at him are no longer amused by his questioning. They're engaged. Not with him. With Musk. The realization unsettles him. Michael clears his throat. People rely on science because it works. Because it produces results. But faith requires people to trust something they can't prove. Musk tilts his head slightly. "So does every invention before it becomes real," he replies. "Before a rocket launches, we run simulations. We test. But in the end, there is always a moment where we take a leap, because no model can predict reality perfectly." Michael swallows, his confidence dimming further. He had prepared to challenge Musk's logic, not to question his own assumptions. He had anticipated an argument, not a shift in perspective. "You make it sound like faith is part of every breakthrough," Michael says, his words slower now, less sharp. Musk nods. "It is. The silence that follows is heavy. Even the hum of the studio lights seems distant now. Michael had walked into this conversation with certainty, but now, uncertainty lingers in the back of his mind. It's not just about Musk's words, it's about what they imply. The audience sees it too. The power in the room has shifted, and Michael knows it. Michael exhales, his shoulders sinking slightly. The fire in his voice has dimmed, replaced by something else. Reflection. The argument he had so carefully built at the start now feels less solid beneath him. He looks at Musk, but for the first time in this conversation, he isn't searching for flaws, he's searching for understanding. His fingers tap lightly against the desk, his mind racing for a way to regain control. But the words don't come. He leans back, the weight of the conversation pressing against him. A quiet moment passes. Then, almost reluctantly, he speaks. I never thought about it like that. Musk studies him, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Maybe it's time we did, he says simply. Michael nods, though he isn't sure if it's agreement or just acknowledgement. He glances toward the camera, aware that millions are watching, waiting for his next move. But for once, he has no prepared response. Musk stands, adjusting his jacket with an ease that suggests he had never felt pressure at all. The room feels different now, not because anything has changed physically, but because the energy has shifted. He turns slightly, offering Michael a small nod before stepping away from the desk. Michael watches him go, still holding on to something unspoken. The conversation was meant to challenge Musk, but instead, it had challenged him. The studio is silent. Even the crew, who had been so focused on capturing every moment, seem caught in the weight of what just happened. The camera lingers on Michael for a beat longer than usual. His hands rest on the desk, his thoughts visibly running through every part of the conversation. Then, the screen fades to black. A single question appears. What do you believe?